Usually, when we talk about getting a medical diagnosis, there's this really comforting expectation of like pure precision.
Right. Yeah, it's binary.
Exactly. You fall, you broke your arm, go to the hospital, and the x-ray shows that stark, jagged white line.
Mhm.
And the doctor just points a pen at the screen and says, right there, that's the fracture.
It's clean. You're either broken or you're not. And I think we naturally crave that.
Oh, totally.
We want our pain to be visible, quantifiable, and neatly categorized so we can just treat it and move on.
Right. But what happens when you try to x-ray a memory?
Oh, wow.
Or in like an emotion? You step into the world of literature, specifically the diagnostic landscape of poetry, and suddenly that pristine x-ray machine just completely malfunctions.
It is the absolute definition of muddy waters.
Yeah.
Because words, unlike bones, they bend for a very long time before they actually snap.
That's a great way to put it.
And a poem carries the immense weight of, everything the author couldn't explicitly say. The fracture isn't in the ink. It's in the white space around it.
I mean, that is exactly why we're here today. For this deep dive, we are looking for those invisible fractures.
Yes, we are.
To do that, we are stepping into the incredibly rich and honestly often difficult world of Nirasha Gunasekera.
Right.
Specifically, we are diving into his 2020 poetry collection, Through and Through, a Lustful Silhouette, or in its original Sinhala, Nura Pirunu Siluvata.
Such a powerful title.
It really is. And to give you a sense of who we are dealing with before we start dissecting the text, Gunasekera is a male Sri Lankan-born immigrant writer, and he currently lives in Australia.
Right. And that biographical reality, that permanent tension between the tropical homeland he left behind and the foreign, often much colder landscape he occupies now, it's going to become intensely relevant.
Oh, absolutely.
But to really grasp the gravity of this 2020 collection,
Yeah.
we have to look at his literary footprints. I mean, he didn't just appear on the scene fully formed.
Far from it. If we look at the historical data, his journey starts way back in 2004 with his first collection.
Right.
Then he follows that up with another release in 2008, and then a 2010 work called Naya Dunsanda Aliyah.
Mm-hmm.
But then there is this massive decade-long gap, 10 years of silence.
Which is huge for a writer.
It is, and what becomes overwhelmingly clear when you read this 2020 release is that those 10 years acted as a kind of psychological pressure cooker.
Yeah, you can physically feel the time that has passed in the lines.
Definitely. This book represents a profound maturation in his craft.
It really is the stark difference between a younger writer trying on different voices and a seasoned writer who has been forced by, well, realities of life, right? Geographic displacement, sheer aging.
Yeah.
He's been forced to radically refine and distill his voice.
Which is exactly why we need to set some strict boundaries for our conversation today.
Good idea.
The entire collection is vast, but we're going to rigorously analyze just one sequential, uninterrupted sequence within it, just poems 31 through 40.
Right, just those 10 pieces.
Yes.
And isolating them sequentially is absolutely vital to understanding his structural intelligence here.
How so?
Well, this isn't just a random playlist of poems thrown together by an editor. It is a highly controlled ecosystem.
Oh, I like that.
The imagery evolves, the symbols accumulate weight, and the emotional resonance builds very deliberately from one page to the very next.
Now, here is where you and I might end up pulling in slightly different directions today.
Uh-oh, bring it on.
I have brought a rather heavy theoretical toolkit with me.
I'm sure you have.
Look, when dealing with themes of displacement and desire, I naturally want to put these texts under a highly critical academic lens. I want to explore how these poems interact with psychoanalysis, with post-colonial theory, phenomenology, effect theory.
Right.
Because I think the only way to truly unpack human isolation is to figure out the underlying psychological mechanisms.
And look, I don't disagree that those frameworks are incredibly illuminating. They absolutely have a place here. But I want to throw a flag on the play right now. We cannot let abstract theory bulldoze the actual poetry.
Fair enough.
As we go through these 10 pieces, I want us constantly evaluating the poet's literal craftsmanship.
You want to look at the nuts and bolts.
Exactly. We have to look at his word economy. We have to ask, is this ambiguity deliberate and productive, or is it just vague?
Right.
Are we looking at a poet relying purely on raw, unrefined talent to just vomit emotion onto the page, or is there a disciplined editorial restraint at work?
That's a really important distinction.
Right. Theory is wonderful, but only if the actual ink on the page supports it. If the theory doesn't fit the poem, We throw the theory out, not the poem.
That is entirely fair. We will keep each other honest. We balance the abstract machinery of the theory with the cold, hard reality of the text. So where does a sequence about profound, unbridgeable distance even begin?
It begins, fittingly, out on the street.
In the twilight, to be exact. The opening of this sequence, the 31st poem, titled Shadows, or Savanelli, places us outside.
Picture two people walking. They're on parallel paths. The sun is setting, which means their shadows are stretching out incredibly long across the ground.
Right.
They are physically close, like the shadows are practically trembling next to each other, but they never actually touch.
What stands out to me instantly here is the visual geometry of the craft.
Tell me more about that.
Well, Gunasekera doesn't just say, we felt distant.
Yeah.
He literally draws these long, thin, gray lines on the ground, these parallel shadows that absolutely refuse to mix.
Yeah.
It is an exercise in pacing. He deliberately slows down time. He is capturing that agonizing, suffocating physical space between two figures where every single footstep feels heavy.
Oh, cold.
And the silence between them is somehow louder than screaming.
Which is exactly why my brain immediately goes to Heidegger and ontological thought.
Okay, let's unpack that for a second. What do you mean by ontological in this specific context?
So ontology is just the philosophical study of being, right? What it actually means to exist.
Right. And a core tenet of existential thought is that human beings are fundamentally inescapably isolated. We are thrown into this world alone, trapped inside our own subjective consciousness.
Yeah, that's heavy.
It is.
Oh,
So
yeah.
to me, these shadows aren't just literal dark shapes on a sidewalk. They are the perfect visual representation of that inherent fragmentation between individuals.
Okay, I follow.
You can walk parallel to someone your entire life. You can share a house, a bed, a physical space. But ontologically, you are entirely separate. The shadow is the projection of a self that fundamentally cannot merge with another self.
It's a heavy concept, yes, but it certainly fits the quiet dread of the scene.
Right.
Setting up that profound, inescapable isolation is a crucial starting point for the entire sequence.
I agree.
But let me push back on the poetic execution here.
Please do.
Let's talk about the originality of the language.
Okay.
Is the parallel lines that never touch metaphor really
Yeah.
that groundbreaking? I
Right.
mean, we've seen parallel shadows used to represent emotional distance in literature for centuries.
That's true. It is very familiar.
It's practically a trope. So does Gunasekera risk drifting into repetition here? Is he relying on a highly familiar, maybe even tired pattern to carry the emotional weight of the poem, rather than generating a new expression?
I see what you're saying. It could definitely feel like a shortcut. But tell me how he handles the rest of the text. Does he save the metaphor?
He absolutely does, and he does it through incredible word economy.
How so?
The brilliance of this piece isn't the shadow metaphor in a vacuum. It's the specific phrasing he builds around the passage of time.
Right.
The entire poem actually hinges on the panic of time running out. There's a moment where the text essentially asks, will time allow them to stay? Twilight is scheduled to arrive.
Oh, that is fascinating. Scheduled to arrive.
Right. That specific verb, choice scheduled, is doing massive heavy lifting. It introduces this cold, bureaucratic sense of inevitability.
Wow.
It's a cosmic deadline.
It's not just that they are apart, it's that the universe is actively turning the lights off on their last chance to connect. Like the window is closing.
Exactly. And the conscious ambiguity of what happens when that twilight actually falls leaves you just like sitting in that uncomfortable silence.
Yeah.
He doesn't tell you how the speaker feels about the shadows. He just points to the ticking clock.
That is brutal.
It really is. And that restraint, choosing to end on the cold scheduling of the dark rather than an explosive emotional confession, it demonstrates highly disciplined structural intelligence.
That ticking clock, that feeling of the light fading. It doesn't just chime, it violently wakes you up in the very next piece.
Oh, absolutely.
The 30-second poem, After the Wild Birds Have Left, is like walking out of a quiet library and immediately getting hit by a passing train.
The tonal shift is massive.
Yeah.
And it's entirely deliberate.
We get this incredibly visceral, almost violent imagery. The poem presents a half-eaten fruit that has been ruthlessly pecked apart and discarded by wild birds.
Yeah.
And this microscopic, ruined object is sharply contrasted with the massive, unrefined noise of a solitary night bus barreling down the road, actively trying to outrun the descending darkness we just talked about.
The transition and scale there is dizzying.
It really is.
You go from the mechanical roar of the bus tearing through the dark, zooming all the way down to this quiet, unsettlingly intimate image of the fruit.
Mm,
The text describes the milky white sap oozing out of this chewed-up fruit, gleaming in the twilight like baby teeth.
like baby teeth. That is such a haunting, deeply uncomfortable image.
It makes your skin crawl a bit.
It does. Think about baby teeth. They are inherently temporary. They represent innocence, like a developmental stage of childhood.
Right.
And the process of losing them inherently involves a tiny bit of violence, right? A bit of blood and exposure.
Yeah, that's true.
So to equate the oozing sap of a ruined fruit with baby teeth, this is where affect theory becomes essential.
Break that down for me. How does affect theory apply to rotting fruit?
Have you ever been so overwhelmed or so traumatized that you feel physically sick or paralyzed before your brain can even formulate the words to explain why you are upset?
Oh, for sure.
That pre-linguistic bodily intensity is what affect theory studies. It bypasses the logical brain and hits the nervous system directly.
Interesting.
This discarded fruit perfectly captures a state of emotional consumption and utter abandonment. It is the pure, visceral feeling of being used up, pecked apart, and left to rot.
Wow.
He isn't explaining his sadness. He is forcing you to feel the revulsion and the loss through sensory intensity.
I mean, it's a spectacular example of controlling a metaphor. The fruit isn't just decaying naturally on the branch. It has been violently wounded.
Yes.
It has been consumed by something wild and careless.
But I want to question the structural intelligence of how these images were assembled.
Okay, let's hear it.
Because while the fruit is a powerful image and the bus is a powerful image, the jump between them feels incredibly jarring. It almost feels unearned.
You think it lacks flow?
Kind of. Is it possible that this poem actually lacks discipline? Does it feel intuitively assembled rather than deliberately composed? Like he had two cool, dark images in his notebook and just smashed them together without building a bridge.
I hear that critique.
Right.
I really do. But I would vigorously defend the pacing here, specifically because of that whiplash.
Why?
Because the jarring shift isn't a failure of structure, it is the structural point.
Oh, I see.
The speaker's subjectivity is fracturing. If you think about how the human mind actually processes profound isolation or distress, it doesn't use smooth, cinematic fade-outs.
That's very true.
It simulates how an isolated, perhaps deeply traumatized mind jumps erratically from overwhelming external noise, the roaring bus, to a hyper-fixated, almost obsessive focus on a tiny detail, like the sap on the fruit.
So the lack of a smooth transition is an accurate representation of a fragmented psychological state.
Precisely. If he had smoothed out that transition and gently guided us from the road to the fruit, it would feel artificially polished.
It would feel too much like a standard poem.
Exactly. It would feel like a poem. The rawness is where the power lies. It shows a poet trusting his raw talent to capture a psychological truth rather than prioritizing a pretty comfortable flow.
That fragmented subjectivity, that intense bodily reaction gets completely weaponized when we move from the isolated street into a crowded, highly performative space.
Oh, yes.
In the 33rd poem, the themes of consumption and observation take a much darker turn. The title itself is a blazing nuance sign. It's called a Lolita, or Lolita-vac.
He is instantly invoking Vladimir Nabokov there.
He is.
Before we read a single line, we are explicitly instructed by the poet to view this piece through the complex, often disturbing lens of desire, performance, youth, and the gaze.
And the poem immediately sets up a highly charged physical contrast. It's a freezing, brutal winter.
Right.
The audience members are bundled up in heavy, thick coats. And then there's a young female dancer on the stage. She is wearing a thin leotard. The Sinhala word used is leotadaya, and she is spinning. The speaker describes how watching the spin leaves him entirely mentally fragmented.
If we are evaluating how erotic language is crafted here, we really have to look closely at this setup. Gunasekera relies on visceral, tactile tension.
Yes, the temperature difference.
Exactly. You have the freezing, biting cold and the thick, protective, almost suffocating barrier of the heavy fur coats on the audience. They are entirely shielded.
Right.
And against that, you have the sheer physical vulnerability, but also the immense kinetic, magnetic power of the thin leotard.
It's quite an image.
It is. The imagery isn't just about looking at a pretty girl. It's about the physics of the room. The text specifically says the dancer takes away 1,000 unbalanced minds in her spin.
1,000 unbalanced minds. Okay, feminist theory and psychoanalysis have to enter the conversation right here.
I figured they would.
Because this poem is practically a textbook study of the male gaze.
In what sense, specifically?
You have the classic historical setup. The active female body on a literal stage reduced to an object of visual pleasure for an audience. And you have the passive male observer projecting his internal fantasy, his lack, onto her. Psychoanalytically, the dancer isn't even a real person to him.
She's a symbol.
Exactly. She becomes an empty vessel for his unfulfilled desire. By explicitly using the word Lolita, he ties this directly to the historical objectification and sexualization of youth.
It is undeniably a highly charged, problematic space of consumption. I agree with that.
But frankly, I have to accuse the poem of indulging in a highly predictable, maybe even outdated trope.
How so?
A middle-aged man watching a young woman dance and feeling overwhelmed by lust. It borders on cliché.
Well,
Does this erotic language risk excess? By writing this, does he just repeat the sins of the male gaze without adding anything new or critical to the conversation? Is it a failure of originality?
okay, if the poem ended on the spin, with the speaker just marveling at her, I would completely agree with you.
Okay.
It would be an indulgent, predictable piece of voyeurism. But what's fascinating, and what reveals the poet's immense discipline, is how Gunasekera pulls the focus at the very end.
Pulls the focus how?
If we shift our framework from feminist theory to masculinity studies, the entire poem inverts. We realize the true subject of the poem isn't the dancer at all.
Wait, really?
It's the profound, almost pathetic vulnerability of the male speaker.
Explain how the focus shifts, because the gaze feels very locked on her body throughout.
It is, until the theatrical lights go down. Look at the structural intelligence of the ending. After the red lights fade and the stage curtain drops, the dancer disappears from the text entirely.
Oh.
What is the reader left with? The final image isn't of her glowing beauty. It is the brutal, self-deprecating image of the aging speaker's own old knees bending and dancing to the clicking sound echoing in his head.
Oh, wow. I missed that. The camera violently pans back to him alone in the dark, and he just looks ridiculous.
Exactly. It is a harsh, uncompromising self-critique of the male gaze.
That's brilliant.
Right. He isn't celebrating his desire. She is exposing his own fragility, his aging body, and his creeping obsolescence in contrast to her vitality.
Oh.
To shift the tonal consistency from a heated, almost predatory lust in the opening stanzas to a cold, pathetic self-awareness in the final lines. That takes incredible technical awareness.
It really does.
It proves the erotic imagery wasn't just indulgence. It was an elaborate trap, a setup for a brutal punchline at his own expense. He is dissecting his own performative masculinity.
That is a brilliant reading. The theatricality of the gaze eventually has to drop, and when it does, he has to deal with himself.
Exactly.
And from that internal, pathetic realization in the theater, we move into an even more personal, claustrophobic space in the 34th poem. It's titled Some Relationships.
This is where the psychological debris really starts blocking the hallway.
The poem explores this very relatable concept of trying to choose a new path in life, of trying to move forward cleanly, only to have the literal rubbish and debris of past relationships suddenly materialize and block the way.
Right.
The central, anchoring metaphor used is a broken window shaking violently in the wind.
If we look at the rhythm and pacing of this poem, Gunasekera does something highly effective to merge the internal and external worlds.
How does he do that?
He uses the physical environment. A dark, incredibly rainy day, the sudden, jarring rattling of a loose window pane, to perfectly mirror the violent intrusion of memory.
The setting matches the mood.
Yeah, but more than that, the poem starts with a kind of quiet, steady determination to move on, and then syntactically the lines start to stumble. The rhythm gets choppy, mimicking the rattling glass.
It is the textbook definition of the return of the repressed, straight out of classic psychoanalysis.
Unpack that a bit.
So the theory argues that traumatic or painful memories that we actively try to bury, they don't just evaporate.
Right, they stick around.
They fester, they mutate, and they inevitably force their way back to the surface, often disguised as something else. In this poem, the psychological baggage of past relationships is literally described as a dark shadow emerging from the trees to frighten the speaker.
So the internal trauma is manifesting as physical debris in the real world. And relying on that physical manifestation is key to how the poem operates emotionally, because the speaker seems unable to process the emotion directly.
But tell me how that works practically regarding the craft.
Okay.
Because there is a specific line where he talks about unread doors opening to an ununderstood world. I have to ask about conscious ambiguity versus actual vagueness here.
I see where you're going.
When a poet uses a phrase like unread doors, is that deliberate and productive, or is it just muddy? Does it weaken the interpretive power?
You think it sounds profound but means nothing.
Sometimes it feels like poets use phrases that sound deep but actually lack precise meaning.
I absolutely see why you'd flag that as vague. Unread doors is not a clean, logical image.
Right.
But I would argue it is a highly conscious, performative ambiguity.
Performative how?
Think about the nature of repressed trauma or a deeply failed relationship. When those memories surface, they rarely make logical sense. They arrive as pure confusion and panic. The speaker cannot articulate the exact nature of why the past relationship failed. That unread door represents a history that was closed before it was ever fully processed or understood.
I see.
The vagueness of the language is the point, because the speaker's own psychological understanding is vague.
Wow, okay.
That's why he has to rely on the shaking window and the shadow in the trees. He can't explain the mechanics of the relationship, but he can perfectly describe the terror it still causes.
So the language intentionally fails because the speaker's ability to logically process the trauma has failed. The vagueness is a feature of his panic.
Right. It's a performative failure of language that dramatically enhances the emotional authenticity of the poem.
Speaking of things we cannot escape and how the physical environment forces memories to the surface, the 35th poem, If There Is a Chance to Meet, takes sensory trigger mechanisms to a whole new level.
Oh, this piece is an absolute masterclass in sensory embodiment.
It really is. The poem hits us with this dense barrage of deep, specific sensory details. We have the heavy, greasy smell of roasting mutton wafting from a chimney. We have the biting, physically painful cold of a deep winter. We hear fragments of old songs, and we are placed in this vast, moonlit wilderness.
Before we go further, let's just lay out what we mean when we talk about phenomenology, because this poem really demands it.
Please do.
Phenomenology, in its simplest terms, is the study of how we experience the world through our physical bodies. It argues that consciousness isn't just a brain floating in a jar. It is fundamentally anchored by what we smell, touch, and feel.
Like how certain smells bring back memories.
Exactly. Think about how the smell of wet asphalt in the summer can instantly transport you back to being 10 years old. That's a phenomenological experience.
Right.
Gunasekera isn't just passively describing a cold night. He is embodying it. He uses this intense sensory overload to anchor his abstract memories.
He explicitly writes about white memories.
Yes. White memories being brought violently into sharp focus by the smell of the roasting meat. The physical smell forces the abstract past into the present room.
And what is critically important here, and where post-colonial and diaspora theory must be applied, is where this sensory experience is actually happening.
Right, the setting.
Let's look at the physical elements he chooses. Roasting mutton, a freezing winter, llamas.
Llamas.
Right. These are fundamentally aggressively un-Sri Lankan images. The poet has been entirely displaced from the tropical, familiar landscape of his birth. This is the physical landscape of the diaspora. And the displacement isn't just geographical, it is profoundly sensory. His body is reacting to a foreign environment.
Yeah.
And that clash of the foreign present, the freezing cold with the internal past, the white memories, creates an intense, almost unbearable friction.
It's the friction of existing in two worlds simultaneously. But from a craft perspective, how does he handle that density?
That is exactly my question for you. Are these images carefully layered, or is it just a messy pile of sensory details dumped onto the page?
You think it's too much?
Well, does the compression of all these elements, the old songs, the roasting meat, the freezing winter, the ghosts of the past, create a razor-sharp intensity, or does it just obscure clarity? It feels very dense, almost claustrophobic.
It is intensely dense, I agree.
Yeah.
But I praise the structural intelligence here because of how he expertly resolves that claustrophobia.
How does he resolve it?
He builds up this incredibly cold, alien, overwhelming external world. But look at the final stanza. The poem shifts from passive observation to an active command.
Right.
He commands the reader, or perhaps himself, to fill their empty vessels with golden water, which we can clearly read as wine or liquor, and dance inside.
Fill the empty vessels with golden water.
Exactly. It's a brilliant, highly controlled structural move. He uses the overwhelming, freezing external landscape of the diaspora to highlight the desperate necessity of constructing internal warmth.
Oh, that's a beautiful...
The hostility of the outside world forces the speaker to retreat inward, to literally consume a synthetic, alcoholic warmth just to survive it. The metaphor is incredibly precise. The outside is cold and full of foreign things, the inside is warm, but it requires filling an empty vessel.
The noise of that sensory overload makes the transition to the 36th poem incredibly shocking.
The whiplash is real.
After all that roaring wind and roasting meat, the text literally unplugs the amplifier. Poem 36 is called The Lake, or Vila.
And if we're talking about raw craft, this might be the absolute pinnacle of technical mastery in the entire sequence.
The scene is incredibly stark. It is a poem about a dark, moss-covered lake. It is utterly quiet.
So quiet.
The only disturbances in the entire piece are a trapped fish making a tiny singular rickle in the water and a distant bird holding a secret song. That's it.
If we are evaluating word economy and pacing, this is the gold standard.
Yeah.
What is left unsaid here is massive. The poem practically breathes silence. The text simply notes that the lake sleeps without any external care. The physical spacing on the page, the agonizingly slow pace, the deliberate lack of action, it forces the reader to sit in the deep discomfort of total stillness.
Theoretically, I read this as a pure ontological metaphor.
How so?
The calm, undisturbed facade of the lake is the external presentation of being, right? How we present ourselves to the world. We look calm,
Right.
but beneath that still moss-covered surface, there is a trapped fish. That fish causing a tiny ripple is the trapped self, the hidden anxieties, the unseen struggles, briefly disturbing the illusion of calm.
That's a great reading.
It captures the tension between how we exist in the world versus the invisible reality of our internal entrapment.
That is a beautiful, highly text-sensitive reading of the metaphor.
Yeah.
But let me anticipate your challenge here, because I know how you look at these things.
You know exactly where my mind is going. I have to push back on the originality of the language here.
Let's hear it.
Because, let's be honest, does the poet rely too much on the still water running deep trope? A calm lake with a dark secret hidden underneath? It's Poetry 101.
It's a classic trope, yes.
Is there true originality here, or is he just executing a very old, very safe trick exceptionally well?
I will argue that the brilliance and the true originality lies not in the lake itself, but in the absence of the speaker. Think about the architecture of the previous 5 poems. They are all heavily, almost aggressively mediated by the ego of the I. I saw the shadows, I felt the cold, I remember the dancer spinning.
That's true. The narrator has been taking up a lot of space.
But in the lake, the I is entirely removed. It is pure, objective observation. The fish struggles, the bird sings, the lake sweeps, and the poet simply acts as a silent camera.
Oh, I see.
It showcases immense editorial restraint. The originality isn't the image of the lake. It's the structural decision to silence the narrator entirely at this specific, highly tense point in the sequence. It gives the reader a necessary emotional palate cleanser.
It's a deep breath before plunging back underwater. Because that silence is a perfect bridge back into the highly specific, incredibly noisy domestic sphere. Which brings us to the 37th poem, In a Foreign Land.
A very explicit title. There is no ambiguity about the thematic terrain he is operating in here.
The speaker is visiting a new house that belongs to old friends, and the poem is heavily, almost aggressively populated with foreign flora and food.
Right.
Weeping cherry trees, ornamental grapes, blue cheese.
The diction here is hyper-specific, and we absolutely must talk about the formatting of the text itself.
What do you mean?
In the original Sinhala text, Gunasekera actually includes footnotes at the bottom of the page for the Sri Lankan reader, explicitly explaining what a weeping cherry is and describing the sharp, pungent taste of blue cheese.
Okay, diaspora theory is the only lens that makes sense here.
Absolutely.
Picture this. The speaker is sitting there, drinking tea with people he has known for decades, looking out at a weeping cherry tree, tasting the sharp bite of blue cheese. This sensory experience is profoundly alienating. The sharp taste of the cheese literally triggers memories of old boundaries and past conversations back in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
It highlights the unbridgeable gap between the homeland and the hostland. The immigrant is perpetually tasting the foreignness of their new reality. They can never just eat cheese. They are eating their own displacement.
The alienation is woven into the very vocabulary of his life now.
But tell me how this works practically as poetry, because I have a major critique of the craft here.
Let me guess. The footnotes.
Yes. I am attacking the structural intelligence of needing footnotes in a poem. If a poem requires an academic footnote to explain its own imagery to the reader, if the poet has to stop and say, by the way, an ornamental grape looks like this, doesn't the metaphor fundamentally fail?
You think it's cheating?
Isn't that structurally indulgent? A poem should stand on its own 2 feet without a user manual attached to the bottom of the page.
I understand why you feel that way,
Mm.
but I fundamentally disagree with you on this specific poem.
But tell me how that works. If I have to look down at the bottom of the page to understand the emotional climax of a poem, hasn't the poet failed to communicate efficiently?
In a standard poem about universal themes, yes, a footnote might signal a failure of poetic economy, but here, the linguistic alienation is the absolute point of the poem.
Okay, how so?
Gunasekera is writing in Sinhala, a language native to a tropical island for a Sinhala reading audience. But he is describing an Australian temperate landscape.
Right.
By forcing the reader in Sri Lanka to drop their eyes down to the footnote to understand the world he is living in, he is forcing the reader to experience the exact same dislocation, the exact same translation fatigue that the immigrant experiences every single day.
Oh, that is incredible. So the physical footnote is a structural simulation of the immigrant experience. The reader has to travel across the page, just as he traveled across the ocean.
Exactly. The specific alien diction shapes the emotional authenticity. The sharp, completely unfamiliar taste of the blue cheese to a Sinhala reader mirrors the sharp realization of the speaker that his life and the lives of his old friends have flowed into this strange, unalterable foreign mold.
Wow.
They can't go back. The footnotes aren't lazily explaining the poem. They are physically enacting the unbridgeable distance between the poet and his motherland. It is a brilliant, defiant use of the pages of physical space.
I concede that is a phenomenal defense of the craft. It turns what looks like a technical flaw into the poem's greatest conceptual strength.
It's pretty amazing.
That feeling of irreversible flow, of lives moving in directions we can't stop, leads perfectly into the 38th poem, The Old Man, the Dog, the River, and Me.
This piece zooms us back in from the macro-level trauma of the diaspora down to a highly specific, granular moment of observation.
The speaker is observing an old man and his dog sitting on a rusted bench. They are having a kind of silent, deeply understood, unspoken conversation as a river flows continuously by them.
The control of imagery here is incredibly raw and unfiltered. I want to focus on one specific visual. The text notes the dog's saliva on its wrinkled cheeks.
Yeah, that's rough.
It's not a pretty, poetic image. It's gritty, it's unrefined, but it anchors the poem in an undeniable, almost ugly physical reality. It shows a poet who isn't afraid to look at the mundane or the slightly grotesque to find emotional resonance.
It is gritty, but the poem doesn't stay in the dirt. It rockets up into the abstract at the very end.
Oh, totally.
The speaker spends the entire poem quietly observing this scene and then suddenly turns the lens inward and asks this massive existential question: though I can flow like a river, am I stopped here like a lake?
It's a stark, terrifying question of agency versus stagnation. Am I moving forward or am I just rotting in place?
Yes, but let's talk about refinement and discipline. Doesn't asking the literal, metaphorical question entirely ruin the ambiguity?
Do you think it's too on the nose?
Up until that very last line, the river and the lake were functioning beautifully as subtext. The moment he literally asks the audience, am I a river or a lake? Doesn't he kill the magic? It feels like an author who doesn't trust his audience to get the point. It feels like raw talent lacking the refinement that a strict editor should have enforced.
I will absolutely concede that it flirts dangerously with being overwritten. It is a risk. He is stepping on his own metaphor by spelling it out.
All right.
However, I will defend the emotional mechanics of that specific choice.
Go on.
By asking the direct, almost childlike question, he forcefully shatters the boundary between the observer and the subject. For the whole poem, he has been safely separated, just a cool, detached observer watching the old man.
Yeah.
The question forces the anxiety out into the open. It's a moment of terrifying clarity where the facade of being the writer breaks down, and he admits his own profound personal fear of stagnation. The lack of refinement is what makes the panic feel genuine.
So you are arguing that sometimes intentionally breaking the rules of good, subtle craft actually achieves a higher emotional truth.
In this specific instance, yes. He trades poetic subtlety for a direct, desperate punch to the gut.
That desperation, that fear of being stuck and unable to move forward, heavily influences how he approaches intimacy. Which brings us to a highly delicate piece, the 39th poem, She Within Her.
This is a rare tone in the sequence. It is an intimate encounter, but an incredibly fraught, complicated one.
The speaker is physically close to a woman. The text literally describes having butterflies in the stomach.
Right.
The physical closeness is described as feeling almost like a competition, a tense sparring match. But the crucial detail, the pivot of the poem, is that the spark doesn't actually catch.
It doesn't.
There is a kiss on the forehead, which leaves an internal lightning strike, but the encounter does not end in physical consummation.
If we evaluate the erotic language as a matter of craft here, the key word is absolute restraint.
Unlike the Lolita poem.
Exactly. Unlike the fiery, almost predatory lust we saw earlier, the erotic language here is entirely about tension. It's about potential energy that is never released. He describes a secret language whispered at the end, pointing to an intimacy that transcends the purely physical.
This is an absolutely fascinating scenario to view through masculinity studies.
Oh, definitely.
Think about the traditional conventions of male-authored erotic poetry across history. It is almost entirely about conquest, about agency, about the male speaker taking what he desires.
Right.
But here, the male speaker is incredibly vulnerable. The physical desire is intensely present, but the agency is yielded. The fact that he centers the poem around an unignited spark completely subverts typical masculine poetic expectations. He is allowing himself to exist in a state of unresolved, unfulfilled desire without turning it into a failure and without turning it into an attack on the woman's agency.
It is a remarkably mature, nuanced portrayal of adult desire.
But let me play devil's advocate on the language itself.
Go for it.
We are continuously evaluating word economy and originality, right? He literally uses the image of having butterflies in the stomach and the spark that doesn't catch.
Yeah.
Are these images just relying on overly familiar, easy patterns rather than generating new expressions? For a poet who has the technical skill to give us the milky sap like baby teeth, aren't butterflies a bit lazy?
It's a very sharp critique, and on a purely surface level, butterflies is a massive cliche.
It is.
But I will defend how he weaponizes it contextually. The familiar, almost juvenile, simplistic physical reaction of butterflies is deliberately juxtaposed with the highly complex, shifting psychological subjectivity of the poem's title, She Within Her.
Walk me through that. How does the title save the cliche?
The title She Within Her means the speaker recognizes that the physical woman standing in front of him is a deeply layered construct. The physical butterflies merely represent the surface-level attraction. But the speaker is trying to find the real woman, the core, she, that is buried deep beneath the physical presence, the outward her. By using a simple, universally recognizable cliché for the physical reaction, he frees up the intellectual space in the poem to explore the incredibly dense, almost impossible psychological puzzle of trying to truly know another human being.
That makes sense.
The cliché is a decoy. He lulls you into a false sense of familiarity before hitting you with the ontological crisis of actual intimacy.
A decoy cliche, I love that. The real work of the poem is psychological, not physical. Which brings us perfectly to the culmination of this entire sequence.
With a final piece.
Right. If true intimacy is an ontological crisis, what happens when it fails? We find out in the 40th poem, in a single mirror.
This piece requires us to synthesize almost everything we've discussed so far.
We are placed inside a two-story house. We are surrounded by that highly specific foreign flora again, a purple hebe bush, star jasmine, magnolia trees. Inside the domestic space, there are empty wine glasses, unread stories scattered about, and then we hit the central devastating image. Two people are standing shoulder to shoulder, looking into a single mirror, but they are seeing entirely separate reflections.
Let's synthesize the imagery first. The flora, the hebe, the jasmine, the magnolia firmly anchors us back in the Australian diasporic landscape. The unread stories scattered in the house clearly echo the traumatic unread doors we saw back in poem 34. The symbols are accumulating massive weight across the sequence.
And then there is the mirror. The mirror is the ultimate final symbol of ontological fragmentation.
It really is.
Even when these two people are sharing the exact same physical moment, sharing a life in this house, looking into the exact same piece of glass, they are fundamentally, irreparably disconnected.
Yeah.
The poem states they are just whoever's reflection. True connection is impossible. The self is trapped behind the glass, entirely unable to reach the other person.
It is a devastating, incredible, quiet image of extreme proximity without a shred of actual intimacy.
But I have to ask about the trajectory of the whole sequence. We just read 10 poems. Does this sequence end on a note of total nihilistic defeat?
How do you mean?
Think about the accumulation of symbols. We started with parallel shadows on the street in the 31st poem. We end with parallel reflections in a mirror in the 40th.
Right.
Has the poet just spent 10 poems circling the exact same emotional ground of isolation? Did we actually travel anywhere, or are we just stuck in a loop of loneliness?
It is absolutely a loop, but I would argue it is a master stroke of structural intelligence, not a failure of progression.
Tell me why.
Look at the architecture of what he has carefully built over 10 pieces. The sequence begins with parallel shadows on the ground, cast by the sun, something entirely external out in public that cannot touch.
Yes.
It ends with parallel reflections in a mirror, something profoundly internal, domestic, highly constructed that cannot truly merge.
Ah, I see the movement there.
Right. He has moved the inescapable isolation from the public street into the most intimate space possible.
Hmm.
The reflection of the self in a shared bedroom. It is a perfectly closed conceptual loop.
That's incredibly well crafted.
He isn't repeating himself. He is proving, methodically, that the isolation is inescapable, whether you are walking outside in the twilight or standing quietly in your own home.
It is the inescapable geometry of the self. So what does this all mean when we finally step back? We need to synthesize our evaluation of Gunasekera's craft. Where does his technical ability stand against his raw, expressive force?
If we look at these 10 pieces as a cohesive breathing unit, we see a poet wrestling with immense, often overwhelming raw emotion, geographic displacement, historical trauma, the anxieties of aging, and unfulfilled desire.
Yeah.
And while there are certainly moments where he occasionally drifts into familiar tropes, or perhaps relies slightly too heavily on stating the mood rather than letting it breathe.
Like the river and lake.
Exactly. But the overarching takeaway is one of immense practiced discipline. His pacing, his profound use of silence in pieces like The Lake, and his brilliant weaponization of the diaspora landscape through highly specific diction and literal footnotes, these show a poet with supreme technical awareness.
I completely agree. The sequence's undeniable strength is its brutal emotional honesty and its piercing, unapologetic sensory specificity. You can smell the roasting mutton, you can feel the biting cold on your skin.
Totally.
Its limitation might be that occasional desperate urge to over-explain its own metaphors, like asking the literal river or lake question out loud. But even those technical flaws feel born from a deeply human, desperate need to simply be understood by the reader.
And we have to position this briefly within contemporary Sinhala literary discourse. For anyone trying to place this work historically, Gunasekera is providing a vital, distinctly diasporic voice.
Very true.
He is physically stretching the boundaries of the Sinhala language to accommodate completely foreign landscapes, forcing it to hold weeping cherries, leotards, and snowy winters. He is proving that the ancient language of his homeland can adapt, painfully but beautifully, to describe the intense alienation of his present reality.
It is a remarkable achievement in translation, not just of language, but of the human experience, which leaves us with a final, lingering thought to mull over.
Always a favorite part.
We spent this time analyzing how Gunasekera uses the intense sensory details of his new foreign environment, the biting cold, the sharp blue cheese, to map out his feelings of isolation.
Because the physical senses become his only anchor to reality when the past is gone.
Exactly. But here's the question for you to explore on your own. If displacement from one's homeland forces the poet to rely so heavily on the intense physical senses of the new country just to feel real, what happens to the concept of home when the sensory memory of the motherland finally begins to fade?
Oh, that's haunting.
When you can no longer accurately remember the exact smell of the tropical rain, but only the stinging bite of the winter wind? How does your current environment rewrite the internal vocabulary of your oldest memories? Because, to go back to where we started, when you finally look at the X-ray of an immigrant's memory, the fractures aren't actually in the bone. They are in the widening spaces between the words they left behind and the strange new words they're forced to use now.